With the festive detachments all here, we will be going through the rest of those over the coming weeks to catch up with them all, but just before 2025 arrives, I wanted to try and get a few more faction review videos up, and I thought what better way to start than sticking with the chaotic theme following the reveal of Fulgrim on Christmas Day, and so today we are going to be looking at one of Fulgrim's least favourite brothers, which is Angron and his World Eaters. Now, as I covered in the Grotmas videos, I do rather like this new World Eaters detachment that they got. If you run a very infantry heavy style army with a load of bodies focused in 2 or 3 key hard hitting units, it can be a very impressive detachment to field. But their basic index one of the Berzerker Warband is also incredibly good, and it brings a really nice buff to every unit you take rather than just doubling down on those specific ones like you do in the Vessels of Wrath. So to begin with, the World Eaters do of course get an army rule. Theirs is Blessings of Khorne, and it's a really fun, unique little minigame style rule, which basically revolves around you rolling 8 dice at the start of the battle round, and then you can pick a selection of 2 buffs based on your rolls. So if you roll any doubles, you can pick either +2 inches to your movement, or you can grant your units a 6-up Feel No Pain. If you roll a double 3, you can pick Sustained Hits 1 with Martial Excellence. A double 4 or any triple lets you choose Total Carnage for a 4+ Fight on Death. Warp Blades can be unlocked with a double 5 or any triple and grants your melee weapons lethal hits. Whilst Unbridled Bloodlust is the big one, this gives you Advance and Charge, and being an option if any of the 8 dice you roll are a double 6 or a triple 4+. So it's quite customizable, and at minimum you will always be getting 2 inches of extra movement and the 6-up Feel No Pain, just based on the fact that rolling 8 dice will net you at least 2 doubles. But if you roll well with this, you can easily get things like 2 inches of extra movement and Advance and Charge, or both lethal and sustained hits in melee, so it really can set you up for a super fast moving or an incredibly hard hitting force when you need it to. So it is just in general a fantastically fun, cool, and quite powerful army rule. The Berzerker Warband detachment nets you a further buff, which is incredibly straightforward and simple, but for your army fantastically good. Relentless Rage just grants your units +1 strength and attack when they have charged. Now, your army is almost always going to want to be charging, so this is pretty much all the time just a brilliant, easy to use buff. And it's a huge bonus on anything from your Berzerkers to Angron to even some of your vehicles like the Heldrake. Getting that bumped up to strength 8 instead of strength 7 means it is going to be much better at killing Marines if it does somehow end up going into them. The Berzerker Warband also has a cheeky little set of enhancements that you can use as well. Favoured of Khorne is 20 points and gives you a once per battle option to essentially get a full redo of your Blessing of Khorne rolls. So after you've made the roll, if you aren't happy with it, you can use this and just get a whole new set of 8. This specifically doesn't count as a reroll, so you can then do any other adjustments or rerolls on individual dice that specific units offer, so it can be amazing if you really need that particular buff on a turn, or you really want Angron back. As we will see in just a bit, he can come back to life in a specific circumstance, so having a better chance of having that go off can be absolutely worth those 20 points. Battle Lust is a cheaper 15 points. This allows the bearer and his unit to heroically intervene for 0 command points, even if you've used the strat already this turn. You are an army that does always want to be in melee, so being able to get that extra unit in or disrupt the enemy's plan by having a unit join a fight that they weren't expecting to can be incredibly strong for the World Eaters. The Berzerker Glaive is a pure output enhancement. This gives you a flat +1 attack and damage on your melee weapons, so this can be utterly brutal on some of your characters. Getting something like a Demon Prince to 8 strength 11 -2 AP 4 damage swings on the charge is just terrifying, or making something like a Master of Executions incredible into enemy characters with their devastating wounds and precision attacks. It is admittedly pricey at 25 points, but it can make the bearer just unbelievably deadly. And then for your final option, you get the Helm of Brazen Ire. This is also fairly pricey at 25 points, but this one is more defensive. It lets you reduce incoming damage by half, so it can make your character unbelievably tanky. And to go back to something like your Demon Prince, with their toughness 10, 10 wounds, and 2-up save, it can let them survive an absolutely insane amount of damage that the enemy might be throwing their way. So it is another, yes, expensive, but very, very useful tool to have and make use of. In terms of the stratagems, as usual, you get your 6, and one of them is pricier at 2 command points, but the rest are 1 CP. Gory Massacre is where we start, which is quite fitting for the World Eaters. This is in the fight phase. After a World Eaters unit has charged and destroyed an enemy unit, it forces a battle shock test on each enemy unit within 6 inches of your unit in the opponent's next command phase. And if the enemy unit is below half strength, they have to take that test at -1. So it can be quite impactful for stopping an opponent keep hold of an objective, or just ruin some of their plans if they had any command phase stratagems to put on a unit. It's not the most amazing stratagem ever, but if you have just destroyed a unit and there are a few other enemies kind of nearby to them, could be worth doing just as a disruption tactic. For the Blood God is next. This is done after a World Eaters unit has fought and destroyed any enemy units. You get to make a Blessings of Khorne roll, and you can then pick a Blessings of Khorne to activate for that unit. So this could potentially let you charge into 2 units, destroy one of them, then activate your blessings and get that 6-up Feel No Pain, for instance, if you didn't already have it up, to keep you safe from your opponent's return swings. It can be a bit niche in terms of what effects will actually be useful, because of course your unit does have to have already fought to get this off, but it can certainly help to keep you alive if you did want to shoot for that 6-up Feel No Pain, or make the enemy really suffer from fighting into you by getting the Fight on Death on a 4+ option. And for 1 command point, it's not a bad call if you do have some scary attacks coming into you from a second enemy unit. For the Skull Throne is also in the fight phase. There is definitely a theme here. This is put on a unit that hasn't fought yet, and you get to add +1 to their wound rolls if they target a vehicle, monster, or character unit for that phase. So now you can be +1 attack and strength on the charge, and also be getting +1 to wound against those tough targets. So it can make even your regular Berzerkers much, much better at going into those slightly more durable enemies. It's really good for 1 command point, and it's not as restrictive as it may seem, because most opponents are going to have either a few monsters or vehicles or character units that you will be going into. So this is basically, most of the time, just a command point for +1 to wound, which in my book is really, really solid. Khorne Cares Not is your 2 command point stratagem. This is again in the fight phase. You pick a World Eaters unit that was selected as the target of an enemy attack, and the enemy attacks are -1 damage into them. So this can do absolute wonders for things like your Berzerkers if they are being hit by 2 damage attacks, essentially doubling their durability against those attacks, and it just gives you a huge defensive bonus from scary enemy units, which means you will of course have more models on your side surviving to swing back in return. So it is fantastically good. It is pricey at 2 command points, but against anything that is 2 or 3 damage coming in from your opponent, this is going to be absolutely worth its weight in gold. Next up we have Blood Offering. This is done in any phase. It lets you pick a World Eaters unit that was destroyed whilst in range of an objective you controlled, and that objective stays in your control until your opponent subsequently controls it. So if you have a unit that gets shot off a home objective, you can essentially just sticky it to keep generating points and victory points for you even after the unit has been killed. So it's really useful for that scoring and objective play, and it is definitely going to be a massive benefit if the opponent is trying to deny you points from your objectives on your side of the battlefield. Finally, you also get Apoplectic Frenzy. This is in your movement phase, and it allows you to just add 6 inches to your movement when you advance instead of rolling a d6. This obviously combos super well with Unbridled Bloodlust. Getting you a guaranteed 6-inch movement means you can much more reliably count on that early advance and charge if you have that blessing up. It can just give you that extra confidence that you can make a charge. You know, if you are 3 or 4 inches away in terms of what you need from your advance roll, just getting that guaranteed 6 inches gives you so much more confidence and kind of reliability in getting that unit into the charge you want to make. So it can just have a huge impact on your battle plan. So again, just another fantastic stratagem. And I would say for one command point, it's an absolute no-brainer when you do have the Unbridled Bloodlust blessing up on a particular turn. In addition to that, you do of course get the Vessels of Wrath detachment. We did cover that in a video literally a couple of days ago, so I'm not going to go through it in super detail here, but I will link the video down below. It's got a more focused rule in Wrath of Khorne, where you can pick a number of character or champion models and they gain the Vessels of Wrath keyword. So they and the units they are with will get this buff. And what it does is essentially it allows you to pick another blessing to be active for them for the battle round. So they can effectively have 3 buffs up and one of them is completely whatever you want to choose. So it's possible for you to always have at least a few units that can advance and charge or can fight on death on a 4+, for instance. So it is very powerful. It is more restricted in terms of just how much of your army can benefit from it. You do give up the army-wide +1 strength and attack on all of your units when they charge, but instead you can supercharge 2 or 3 of your units, which in some situations may definitely be worth it. They are both very good detachments and they work very well with the World Eaters. I think it's just more a preference as to whether you want that wider, broader buff or the more narrow focused one that just gives you a couple of ridiculously strong units and have them pretty much carry the game for you. In terms of what you will be using though, onto the units themselves, we start off of course with the Primarch Angron. He clocks in at a hefty 435 points, but he is, as you would expect, super killy. He's got a really good profile just in general. He's got a 14-inch move, toughness 11, 16 wounds, a 2-up save, a 4-up invuln, and also deep strike, which can help him get where he needs to be. He does have his dual weapons of Samniarius and Spine Grinder, which do have a strike and a sweep profile. The strike is 8 attacks at strength 16, -4 AP, and d6 +2 damage, whilst the sweep is still terrifying. It's 18 attacks at strength 8, -2 AP, and 2 damage. So on the charge, he can kill around 9 Marines in a single go, or he can one-shot an Imperial Knight, doing around 27 damage to it with the strike profile. So he really is very killy. But it isn't just all about him either. He can boost those around him. At the start of the charge phase, you can pick one of 3 Wrathful Presence buffs. Glorious Bloodletting gives +1 to charge rolls for World Eater units within 6 inches of him, so just making it that much easier for him and his followers to get into combat. Infectious Rage impacts a World Eater's unit that is below starting strength that's within 6 inches of him. They get +1 attack, so if Angron is below full wounds, he could be getting 10 strike attacks on the charge, which is also pretty terrifying. And then the final option is Righteous Slaughter. This is also a 6-inch aura. This gives World Eater's units re-roll hit rolls, so he can make himself and the units around him either faster and better at getting into combat, or killier, either by giving them more attacks or just making them a lot more accurate. All of them are brilliant buffs in themselves, and having them go off in the charge phase I think is really good because it does let you choose the exact one you need at that moment just before you are going into combat. If you are maybe 6 or 7 inches away and you really don't want to fail the charge, maybe going for the +1 to your charge rolls will be the better option. If an enemy unit has -1 to be hit or something, then maybe going for the rerolls will help you overcome that. It is just a really solid set of bonuses, and when they go off is brilliantly timed for Angron, so you really can make the best decision about which one to use. As mentioned, he does also interact with the Blessings of Khorne. His Reborn in Blood rule means that if you roll 3 6s on your 8 dice and Angron has been destroyed in the game, he can come back and be put into reserves with his full wounds. So if he gets shot off the board in turn 1, he does have a few chances to come back at full strength. deep strike in and just utterly ruin your opponent's day. This also crucially doesn't have a once per battle caveat or anything, so he can come back, potentially die again, and then come back a second time or a third time if you manage to roll really well on your blessings dice. Overall, yes, he is expensive, but he is incredibly killy, and he can be deceptively durable, I think, with not only a fairly beefy stat line, but the fact that he can come back with full wounds. Whilst it's not super reliable, it can make him an absolute nightmare to deal with, and it can almost make your opponent sometimes not want to kill him because they run the risk of him coming back and deep striking right into their backfield in the next turn. The favoured son Khârn is up next. He's much cheaper at 100 points. He has the typical marine profile of a 6-inch move, toughness 4. He does have 5 wounds, but he does only have a 3-up save, although of course the 4-up invuln he has does help with that. He can join Khorne Berzerkers, and he does have his signature plasma pistol as his ranged weapon, whilst he has the axe Gorechild for melee. The pistol is always overcharged, giving him a single strength 8, minus 3 AP, 2 damage shot, which is okay, but in melee he is obviously much better. 8 strength 6, minus 2 AP, 3 damage swings does make him really quite scary into Marines and even Terminators. On the charge, he's going to be netting 9 strength 7 attacks, which will kill about 2 or 3 Terminators by himself, so for his cost that isn't actually all that bad. He also gets Legendary Killer, which means he and his units can reroll hit and wound rolls of 1, so it will massively boost his own output as well as the models in his squad. But conversely, he can also kill the models in his squad thanks to the Betrayer rule. And what that means is that if his unit isn't in engagement range of an enemy at the end of your charge phase, you do have to make a leadership test, and if it is failed, then a bodyguard model in his unit just dies. So this isn't always going to happen. With a leadership of 6+, you should be safe a good chunk of the time, but do just be aware that he can end up killing a few of your own models in his blind rage as you do move them up and into combat. He also gets to fight on death. This is really good. It isn't even a roll, it is just guaranteed. Berserker Frenzy means that when he is destroyed by a melee attack, he can fight before you remove him. So even if he gets charged and killed off by, say, the lion, he can still fight, and he does knock off about 3 wounds from the lion in return, so he is quite a threat, even if the enemy is charging in and is going to get to swing first, which does add, in a way, a bit of utility to him, because he's almost this deterrent to enemy units charging in, because they will know if they kill him in melee, he is going to be swinging back before you remove him. The Lord Invocatus is another epic hero that you get access to. He's on a Juggernaut, which does make him rather mobile and pretty tanky for his not super pricey 140 points. He's got a 12-inch move and toughness 6 with a 2-up save and a 4-up invuln and 8 wounds, so that's absolutely not shabby. And with the Scout's 6-inch rule he is also much better at getting a potential early game charge off than you might initially think. He can join Berzerkers or both varieties of Eightbound, and he can also grant 2 infantry units within 6 inches of him at the Scout's 6-inch rule at the start of the battle. So if he has joined a unit of Eightbound and you have another unit nearby, they can both move up an extra 6 inches at the start of the game, giving you a massive presence in the midfield right from the get-go, which really can put your opponent on the back foot. And just to mention there, because regular 8-bound already have the Scout 6-inch move themselves, if you put him with a unit of the regular 8-bound, that is potentially 3 units that can use a Scout 6-inch move, because obviously Invocatus will get it with the 8-bound he's with, and he can give it to 2 other infantry units. So if you have a unit of 8-bound and then 2 units of Exalted 8-bound either side of him, all 3 of those units will be making a 6-inch Scout move at the start of the game, which is really quite an impressive amount of bodies and damage output moving up towards the midfield right from the get-go. He also grants his unit the counterattacks ability, which means they can shoot and charge after they've fallen back, so this is just going to let his unit cycle charge to get those buffs up all the time and, move from combat to kill as much as he possibly can. In terms of his own output, he does have a bolt pistol, which is kind of meh, but in melee, his axe, the Coward's Bane, is 7 attacks at strength 6, minus 2 AP and 2 damage, and it's got devastating wounds, and he also has 4 extra attacks from his Juggernaut, which are strength 6, -1 AP and 2 damage with Lance. So he can actually do a good bit of work on the charge. The devastating wounds will make him really scary into things like Terminators, but with 2 damage and 8 attacks on the charge, he is also incredibly good at killing things like Marines. So he's a great investment for his cost. He brings some decent output in his own right, but that extra movement he grants his unit and some other infantry units with the scout rule is, in my opinion, just worth that 140 points all by itself in an army like the World Eaters. If instead you want something a bit more demonic, then the Demon Prince is next. The regular one is 200 points, and he gets you the hefty toughness 10, 2-up save, 4-up invuln with 10 wounds. He can still move fairly fast at 8 inches, and he brings a rather brilliant aura, granting a 5-up invuln save to infantry units within 6 inches of him. So all of your 8-bound or Berzerkers and that sort of thing can be much more durable as they move up the board when they are next to him. He also gains the devastating wounds on his melee attacks after he's charged, so essentially if you give him the enhancement I mentioned earlier, the Berzerker Glaive, he can be throwing out 8 strength 11, -2 AP, 4 damage swings with devastating wounds on the charge, which is disgustingly good, and he will absolutely rip through vehicles, Terminators, Custodies, pretty much anything with that weapon stat line. And even in the sweep profile with his Hellforged weapons, even though it's got no AP, that will still get you around 5 dead Marines thanks to the pure weight of dice and those devastating wounds. So he is just brilliant with that enhancement. The winged version is cheaper at 170 points, and it trades 1 toughness for 4 inches of movement. So he's still somewhat durable, but a decent bit more mobile. He keeps the same weapons, but his abilities change, so he doesn't get the dev wounds or grant the invulnerable aura. Instead, he forces a battle shock test on enemy units in engagement range at the start of the fight phase with Bloodied Terror, and he also gets to pick an enemy unit at the start of the battle to be his sworn foe. And he then gets to reroll hit and wound rolls against them for the entire game. So it really is quite powerful. It can make your Demon Prince incredibly good into that one specific unit. It does have the drawback that if the enemy unit hasn't been destroyed by the end of the battle, your Demon Prince also gets destroyed, so that could impact things quite significantly if they manage to avoid you all game long. I mean, in general, it does boost his output quite a lot, and he is of course 30 points cheaper than the non-winged version, but I'm not entirely sold on the idea of giving up that invulnerable aura and also the devastating wounds. I don't think the winged version is bad. He can be very, very potent at killing that key enemy unit if you make it your sworn foe. I'm just not sure he is as worth it overall compared to the regular foot version. The non-named version of Lord Invocatus is your regular Lord on Juggernaut. He's 40 points cheaper at just 100 points, so the easy comparison here is with Khârn the Betrayer. The Lord gets a 10-inch move, toughness 6, 7 wounds, and a 2-up save with a 4-up invuln, so it is a good bit better than Khârn from that perspective. He does get a plasma pistol as a ranged weapon, and then in melee, he keeps the same Juggernaut attacks like Lord Invocatus, but his Exalted Chainblade is instead 7 attacks at strength 6, -1 AP and 2 damage. So it's not the best armor piercing, but it still isn't bad, and on the charge getting 8 attacks means he can kill 2 Marines by himself, and then the Juggernaut will kill another 1, so they will kill off 3, maybe 4 Marines on the charge between them if you're lucky. They can also do a bit more because they get impact hits with the Bloody Stampede rule. So on a 2 to 3, you put 1 mortal wound on an enemy, D3 mortal wounds on a 4 to 5, or a whopping D3 plus 3 mortal wounds if you roll a 6 after they've charged into an enemy unit in engagement range. So they can quite feasibly kill off a 5-man Marine unit when they charge in. And then the aggressive charge ability helps this further by giving the Lord and his unit a reroll for any advance, charge, or blood surge rolls that they make. So the reroll charges is obviously super handy, but with the right blessing, getting you a reroll on your advance rolls as well can make that early game charge incredibly reliable. Getting the ability to advance and charge, rerolling both of those rolls can be super good. and like the Lord Invocatus, being able to join 8-bound of both varieties or Berzerkers does give the Lord a good bit of option for the kind of units he wants to be joining and then going after. So I think he's actually a very, very good pick for 100 points. We aren't done with the characters yet, there's still one more to go. The Master of Executions is the non-named Infantry HQ. He's actually pricier than you may think. He's 110 points, but there is quite a good reason for that. Although his profile isn't super amazing, he's got a 6-inch move, toughness 4, 4 wounds and a 3-up save. He can be a huge force multiplier. He's got a fairly decent melee weapon with the Axe of Dismemberment. This gives him 5 strength 7, minus 2 AP, 2 damage swings, but they have precision and devastating wounds. So with strength 8 on the charge and 6 attacks, he can really easily kill off enemy characters. He can quite reliably do a solid 4 wounds to a toughness 4, 4-up invulnerable save, a marine style character in a turn, so he can just insta-kill things like chaplains or librarians. He also gets to re-roll hit and wound rolls against character units, so making it even more likely that he can punch up into scarier characters. And against someone like the Lion, with those rerolls, he can still expect to do a good 5 or 6 damage, so he won't kill the Lion, but you can seriously injure him if you fish for those devastating wounds. On top of that, he gets a really nice buff for his unit, which can only be Khorne Berzerkers, but they all get the Fights First ability if he's with them. So they can utterly demolish an enemy unit. Even if they don't manage to get the charge off, they still get to probably fight first and just kill a whole bunch of your opponents before they can swing. So the Master of Executions, yes, he is expensive, but he can be brutal, and he's a great pick for something like the Berzerker Glaive, giving him that extra attack and damage. 7 strength 8, minus 2 AP, 3 damage swings on the charge with fights first, precision, devastating wounds, and that can reroll hit and wound rolls against character units. That is just absolutely terrifying. And talking of the units that he can join, the Khorne Berzerkers are up next. They come in a unit of 5 for 90 points or a unit of 10 for 180. And what that means is that 18 points is netting you a toughness 4, 3-up save, 2 wound model with a 6-inch move that's got a fairly scary amount of melee. They each come with a chain blade, which grants them 4 strength 5, minus 1 AP, 1 damage attacks, and then 1 in 5 can take an eviscerator for 3 strength 8, minus 2 AP, 2 damage swings. Obviously, these all get boosted on the charge in the Berzerker Detachment, so a full unit of 10 can have 40 strength 6 and 8 strength 9 attacks, which really will let them do a lot of work into enemy infantry or even tougher monsters and vehicles. They can also take an Icon of Khorne, which helps with your army rule. It lets you reroll a single Blessings of Khorne dice if you have a unit with an icon in range of an objective marker you control. So with a couple of these spread around your army, that can get you a few rerolls on your army rule to help you fish for the specific results you need, which is super, super handy. And then they can also get some extra movement with their Blood Surge rule, which essentially lets them move d6 inches after they've been shot by the enemy and any models from your unit have been destroyed. So as your opponent tries to thin out your unit, you can just move up the board that bit quicker. Now you do have to move towards the closest enemy, but this can just get you up the board quicker. It can potentially get you into engagement range too, so you can use this to get into combat to tie up some enemy shooting or just keep your unit safe from some further shooting that was coming their way. It is a really great rule, and again, on a melee army like World Eaters, anything that will help you get up the board quicker is fantastic. The Jakhals are your cultist equivalent. They are much squishier than your Berzerkers, but they are, of course, also much cheaper. They are just 65 points for 10 or 130 points for a full 20. They're only toughness 3 with a 6-up save, so they are very, very easy to kill, but they do come with a 6-up Feel No Pain as a core ability, so that does help a little bit. And they're also incredibly handy from an objective point of view. Their objective Ravaged rule grants you sticky objectives, so you keep control of the objective even if they then move off to go and fight somewhere else on the board. In melee, they're okay. They do have a good volume of attacks, but I mean, they're not amazing attacks. The Chain Blades are 2 attacks that hit on 4s at strength 3, 0 AP and 1 damage, but they do have sustained hits 1, plus in the Berzerker Detachment, they can be +1 attack and strength on the charge, so it can all add up. And they also get a few options in their loadout, things like the Dishonored, which is a 1 in 10 option, get a slightly better chain blade, which is base strength of 4, or they can take a Skull Smasher, which gets them 2 strength 5 attacks at -1 AP and 2 damage. So it's nothing super amazing, but a full unit of 20 on the charge could be quite scary. And then a minimum unit of 10 can, if nothing else, be a really good tool for screening or doing some secondary or objective play, whilst the rest of your force, like the main meat of your force, just charges up and into the enemy. Naturally, you do get some Terminators to play around with as well, 36 points per model in either a unit of 5 or 10. They get the usual toughness 5, 3 wounds, and 2 up save, 4 up invuln of every other Terminator, and the same option of accursed weapons or chain fists or power fists to go along with their combi bolters, their heavy flamers, or their Reaper autocannons that we see in other Chaos Terminators. They can be quite scary in melee with this army and with the Berzerker detachment, getting +1 strength and attack on the charge, or even being in the Vessels of Wrath detachment. They are a good pick to get that extra blessings buff on them, getting them 2 inches of extra movement and advance and charge, and maybe sustained hits or lethal hits can make them incredibly killy. They do on top of that get their own rule in Bloody Fury. This gives them +1 to hit if your unit is below starting strength, and +1 to wound if they are below half strength. So even as you start to lose models, your individual models do just get better. So a unit of 10, even when it's dropped down to say 4 models, can still be throwing out 12 strength 10, -2 AP, 2 damage attacks, and 4 strength 10, -3 AP, 2 damage attacks with +1 to hit and +1 to wound. And that really will help them to just keep doing as much damage as possible, even as they are whittled down to the last model. I think one of the biggest drawbacks with the Terminators is there isn't really anything that can join them. It would be great to have something like a Terminator Lord to just give them some more access to a few buffs or some enhancement support, for instance, but as it stands, they are still pretty solid, and if you want a hard-hitting, durable melee unit, they can do that pretty effectively. They do face competition though from things like the Eightbound, and they may be a better pick if you want that hard-hitting melee unit. They are a bit pricier, 3 of them costs you 140 points, so they're about 46 points each, but that gets you almost double the move at 9 inches and a better toughness 6. They are still 3 wounds, but they do only have a 3 up save and a 5 up invuln, so they are overall a little bit squishier, but they are much more mobile, which is made even more so by the fact that they have the Scout's 6-inch rule, so they can really get up the board and get into melee much, much quicker than your Terminators. Where they also shine is that they're a pretty decent buffing unit as well. Their Beacons of Rage rule means that anything within 6 inches of them, all your friendly World Eaters units within 6 inches of them, get to reroll wound rolls of 1 when they're in melee, and they get full rerolls to wound if the enemy unit is below half strength. So they are a pretty solid force multiplier, and this of course does impact their own output too, of course, which is quite nasty in itself. The Eightbound come with Eviscerators, which are 6 attacks each at strength 5, -2 AP and 2 damage, whilst the champion has a Lacerator, which is 4 strength 9, -2 AP at 3 damage swings, or he can instead take a heavy Chain Glaive, which grants him 8 strength 7, -3 AP, 1 damage swings if you want them going into melee with stuff like infantry. And it can just make them a fairly potent combo in the Berzerker Warband. It can mean that a minimum unit of 3 can be throwing out 14 strength 6 and up to 9 strength 7 attacks, which will just make them absolutely fantastic at cutting through Marines or Guardsmen or Fire Warriors and that kind of thing. The Exalted variant are even pricier still. They're 155 points for 3 or 310 points for 6, so they are a hefty 51 points per model. They do keep the same profile with toughness 6, 3 wounds, 3 up save and a 5 up invuln, but what they swap is the army buffing aura for another ability called Overwhelming Wrath. And what that means is that enemy units that want to fall back have to make a leadership test, and if they fail it, they can't fall back. So it's potentially super useful if your opponent really has a unit that needs to fall back, but I don't think it's as good as the regular 8-bound aura personally. Where the Exalted 8-bound maybe do shine a bit more is in their output, which can be quite substantial, especially against vehicles. Each one has an Eviscerator and a Chain Fist, so it lets you either do 5 strength 6 minus 2 AP 2 damage swings, or 3 strength 14 minus 3 AP 2 damage attacks each. And then the champion can either take paired Chain Fists for 5 attacks with twin linked at the same strength 14 profile, or the heavy Chain Glaive that we just saw for 8 strength 7 minus 3 AP 1 damage attacks. So they can be a really scary anti-tank unit with those Chain Fists. A minimum unit of 3 can do about 12 wounds to an enemy gladiator tank, so pretty much one-shotting it if the champion takes the paired Chain Fists. So they are a really quite good anti-armor unit. They are just very pricey for that, and I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure they are worth it over the cheaper and I would argue more generally useful for the rest of your army unit that is the normal 8-bound. Following those, the World Eaters do also get a nice selection of the regular Chaos units. I'm not going to go into these in too much depth because they have been covered a lot before. Most people know what they do because they've been around for ages or from the main Chaos Codex. But you get access to things like a Land Raider, which for 240 points does get you a durable toughness 12, 16 wound transport with some fairly decent shooting with the 2 Soul Shatter las cannons, and also the ability to transport 6 8-bound or Terminator models. Like the Marine version, it gets the Assault Ramp ability for a unit to disembark and still charge, so this does essentially up your movement to 10 inches. This is amazing for your Terminators, maybe a little bit less useful for the 9-inch move on your 8-bound, but it can keep you safe as you move up the board, and it is certainly a viable option if you want a unit of 5 Terminators to get up the board and make a charge as soon as they possibly can. The Predator Annihilator and Destructor are both 130 points, and they get you some decent fire support if you want to run a bit more of a mixed list. The Annihilator can be throwing out 2 strength 12 and 1 strength 14 twin linked las cannon shot, and the updated Annihilator rule now lets you reroll damage rolls against monsters or vehicles, which means that d6 plus 1 damage has got a fairly good chance to knock off a good chunk from most enemies. Comparatively, the Destructor variant, that instead is much better against infantry. This one gets you a bonus pip of AP against infantry, so if you kit this out with, say, a Predator autocannon and 2 heavy bolters, you can then be lighting up an enemy squad with up to 6 strength 9 minus 2 AP 3 damage shots and 6 strength 5 minus 2 AP 2 damage shots. So it isn't awful. It can on average kill off a Terminator and a couple of Marines each shooting phase. So it definitely has some potential for just clearing out some bodies and thinning up an enemy squad before your forces charge into them. The Defiler is a bit pricier at 190 points, but it does have the nice toughness 10, 14 wound profile and a 3-up save backed up with a 5-up invuln. As usual, it comes with a plethora of options, but the base loadout of the Defiler cannon, Reaper autocannon, heavy flamer, and claws is pretty scary. The Defiler cannon is a nice d6 plus 3 shots with blast at strength 10, minus 1 AP and 3 damage, so it can hurt vehicles and things like Terminators pretty well, whilst the claws give it a fairly terrifying 5 strength 16 minus 3 AP d6 plus 1 damage attacks in melee, so even against knights it can do pretty well, knocking about 10 wounds off of one as you charge in. The datasheet ability it has is fairly boring, but it is quite useful for such a big model. Scuttling Walker means that you can move over friendly monster and vehicle models and also through terrain that is less than 4 inches tall as if it wasn't there, so making it a lot less likely for you to get trapped in some awkward terrain or scenery on the battlefield. Both the Forgefiend and the Maulerfiend are also available for you, the Forgefiend giving you yet more ranged fire support at a slightly higher price than the Predators, 145 points, but this nets you a better profile, toughness 10, 12 wounds with a 3-up save and a 5-up invuln, and then you get the option of either the Hades autocannon or the Ectoplasma cannon. I personally prefer the Hades, taking 2 of them and then keeping the Jaws I think is a decent mix, gets you 12 strength 8, minus 1 AP, 2 damage shots at 36 inches, but then still lets you do some okay melee if you do get caught by the enemy with 5 strength 7, 2 damage swings in combat. The Maulerfiend by comparison is pretty fantastic for the World Eaters. 140 points for the same stat line but with a 10-inch move, and the fantastic rule in the Scent of Blood. This gets you plus 2 inches to your charge rolls if the enemy you are charging is below starting strength, and also plus 1 to hit with your melee attacks if the enemy you're fighting is below starting strength. So in a full melee loadout, this can end up with 7 strength 15 minus 2 AP d6 plus 1 damage attacks on the charge that hit on 2s, whilst the extra attacks from the Lasher Tendrils get you a few bonus anti-infantry ones at strength 7 and minus 1 AP. Now the fists from a Maulerfiend alone can net you nearly 12 damage into an enemy knight, so for still under 300 points, 2 of these can quite reliably just demolish most enemy vehicles, so they are, if nothing else, a fairly brilliant distraction Khârn effects for a World Eater's army. The Helbrute is your Dreadnought equivalent, of course. Pretty cheap at 130 points, but it is quite slow with a 6-inch move. Otherwise, it is fairly standard. Toughness 9, a 2-up save, and 8 wounds. It does have some good options for both melee and ranged loadouts, depending on what you need. But obviously, in a World Eater's list, you are probably going to go melee heavy. It can do some fairly scary tricks with the Frenzy rule, letting it either shoot or fight after it's being targeted by an enemy shooting or melee attack, and you can actually chain this quite amazingly in combat, letting you activate, pile in, fight, and consolidate, and then when the enemy unit you've consolidated into attacks you, this will proc again, letting you activate and fight, potentially consolidate again if you kill them into another unit, so you really can daisy chain this to get a lot of activations if you line it up well, and it can make something like a Helbrute a really scary threat just stomping through the enemy backfield. For 210 points, the Heldrake is still paying the fly attacks. It's not really worth it. It does look cool, but at over 200 points, you are essentially paying for a slightly scarier heavy flamer and the ability to do some mortar wounds on an enemy you fly over. It is just pretty bad, really, and I think this needs to drop a good 70 or 80 points before it can even be vaguely considered worth it. 75 points can also net you a Rhino if you want to transport some Berzerkers around. It can take 12, so it can take 10 Berzerkers and Khârn, for instance, which can help them get up the board a bit more reliably and safely. It doesn't do a huge amount else, but if you are up against a very shooty army, these can be absolutely worth their weight in gold just to keep your stuff alive as you get them up the board ready to charge. You also get the option to take Chaos Spawn. These come in a unit of 2 for 70 points, so 35 points for an 8-inch move, toughness 5, 4 wound, 4-up save model with a 5-up feel no pain. It's not bad as far as a distraction unit goes. They can work quite well as fast-moving screens or blocking units. They do also regain D3 wounds each command phase, so they can be quite tricky to get rid of with just light incidental firepower like bolters. So they're not amazing, but if you do have some spare points and you want to bring something to help maybe draw some fire away from your more important units, they can work quite well for that. And then finally, we have the big unit, the Lord of Skulls. This thing is a whopping 450 points, but its toughness 13, has 24 wounds, a 3-up save, a 5-up invuln, so it is pretty darn tanky. It can also move pretty well with an 8-inch move, and it also blows up for d6 plus 2 damage with its deadly demise, so it can even do a bit of work when it is finally killed. This thing really boosts your blessing rolls. It lets you add or subtract 1 to a dice roll for each unit this model has killed. So if your Lord of Skulls has killed 2 enemy units, then each time you make a Blessings of Khorne roll, you can amend 2 of the dice out of the 8 to be either plus or minus 1. This is really, really good. It makes it much more likely that you can get the roll you want. It makes it much more likely that you can get Angron back, for instance, or get that 444+ for advance and charge. It is just a hugely powerful force multiplier for your army rule. You do also get some pretty scary output from it. The Gorestorm Cannon and the Hades Gatling Cannon are the base ranged loadouts, getting you d6 plus 3, strength 10, minus 2 AP, 3 damage shots, and also 12 strength 8 minus 2 AP 2 damage shots with sustained hits 1 from those two, or they can be swapped out. The Gatling Cannon can be changed for a Skull Hurler, which is 2d6 strength 14 minus 3 AP 3 damage shots at 60 inches, whilst the Gorestorm Cannon, you can instead take a Demon Gore Cannon, which gets you d6 strength 14 minus 4 AP, d6 plus 2 damage shots with the blast, or the Ica cannon, which is 2d6 shots. They're only strength 7, but minus 2 AP and 2 damage makes them pretty good at killing Marines. All the options are pretty damn scary, to be honest with you. They are great at killing anything from Marines to Terminators to monsters and vehicles. Personally, I would probably take the Demon Gore and the Hades. That gives you a great mix, in my opinion, of anti-tank and anti-infantry firepower. But if you, for instance, wanted to go purely after vehicles, something like the Skull Hurler will on average put around 8 wounds into a Marine tank, so it is a pretty solid pick on top of the Demon Gore cannon as well. On the melee front, you get the Great Cleaver of Khorne. This is either 5 strength 16 minus 4 AP 8 damage swings, or 15 strength 8 minus 2 AP 2 damage. The flat 8 damage is of course ridiculous. On the charge, this will get you an average of 21 wounds into a knight, but obviously with how damage is worked, it's either going to be 16 or 24 damage into the knight, so you will either kill it or you will at least seriously injure it in a single blow, whilst the sweep profile nets you about 6 dead Marines, which isn't a huge amount admittedly, but on top of your shooting, this can do a load of work into most types of enemy that you will come across, and it does of course give you that brilliant play with the army rule as well. So I think even with the 450 point price tag, this thing can be very much worth it. And that is the World Eaters. There's quite a lot to cover for such a relatively small faction, but overall I think there is a lot to like in this army. They have 2 really good, really fun, really strong detachments. They've got a load of pretty powerful stratagems and enhancements and abilities. They can run a really powerful, fast-moving melee threat, and with the right setup and planning, they can make some truly scary Death Star-style units that can just be in the enemy's face right from turn 1 and will just absolutely murder anything they come into contact with. But, as always, what are your thoughts on the World Eaters, and which of the 2 detachments they have so far do you like the most? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.